Welcome to lecture number 16. This is on pro-social behavior, and that, broadly speaking, is helping others. We'll have two lectures on this. As we begin, I'd like you to think about the intriguing question, and that is, do you think a person's knowledge of social psychological research on helping behavior can actually affect their helping behavior once they've learned it? And the answer to that question turns out to be yes, but you could think about why that might be the case. These announcements are somewhat dated because I'm behind on these lectures, but nonetheless, there they are. So as we get started, think about helping behavior, and think about your motives in particular, because it turns out that motives are very important to a central question for researchers in this area, which is whether helping behavior is motivated by more or less self-interested behavior or self-interested motives, helping for the sake of helping yourself, or for more purely altruistic reasons, where the motivation for helping the other person is only for the benefit of the other person. So some of the questions that are related to research in that area in determining the motives is, what was your motive for helping when you were helping out another person? Does it depend upon what type of helping situation it is? What's the most expensive thing that you ever received? When someone's helping you, what were their motives? Oftentimes we think about whether or not the person has some special relationship to us. And then sometimes you think about the situations where you've helped a complete stranger or you've been helped by a complete stranger. And then how do you think about that? Why does that happen? There's an interesting example of altruistic behavior here in the URL at the bottom of the screen. I encourage you to load that into your browser and have a look. And maybe ask your questions pertaining to that situation of helping. What was the helper's motivation in those cases? So just as a broad outline of the chapter, we'll talk about different goals for helping behavior, or pro-social behavior as social psychologists call it. And then we'll also look at the question, does pure altruism exist? But in those first four sub-points there you see, improving our basic welfare by gaining genetic or material benefits, gaining social status and approval, managing self-image, or managing our moods and emotions. These are all explanations of motives that are behind helping behavior that, sure, it's helping another person, but there is a selfish goal or a selfish motivation behind that. And those 4 bullet points you see there are all theories and associated research that shows that helping behavior is often motivated, in addition to some kind of desire to help the other person, it's a desire to help ourselves. And then we'll address the question of whether pure altruism exists, which is helping only for the benefit of the other person. So, as we were just saying, defining true altruism focuses on this definition. True altruism is an action or behavior intended solely to benefit another person. So the only intention is to benefit the other person, and there is no gain of external or internal rewards. Some other qualifiers on this behavior is that it's performed voluntarily. No one's forcing you to engage in this helping behavior. It's not motivated by avoiding punishment, like being ashamed or embarrassed or feeling guilty after the fact if you don't help, or being, scolded by your mother or your peers for not helping. And obviously it's not motivated by self-interest. That's the definition of pure altruism. Now, altruism is a subset of a much broader definition of behavior called pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior is helping behavior regardless of the motivations. So the definition here, as it says, is behavior that benefits other people regardless of the motivation. So one example might be that you donate your time or your money for the sake of public relations. That could be like a corporation doing something beneficial for the community and then advertising all over the place about how good a corporation it is because they help people out. It could be something like you doing some volunteer work and telling your boyfriend or girlfriend or potential boyfriend or girlfriend about your volunteer work as a way of kind of bragging about what a nice person you are. Another example is what's sometimes referred to as benevolence. This isn't really in your textbook, but this is pro-social behavior for internal rewards. So a person donates money, for example, in an anonymous fashion, and therefore there's no external reward. People aren't going to find out, what a nice, generous person you were, but you feel good about your anonymous donation. So there's some internal benefit in the satisfaction you feel in having helped some other people. That's benevolence. And a third example is when you donate or help out to avoid feeling guilty because other people have shamed you into it. So when you were faced by somebody who's maybe soliciting donations for cancer research and or against domestic violence or something, and you don't really feel like donating, but your friends are kind of guilt-tripping you into doing it, and you do it anyway. So in a diagram, we see pro-social behavior is the broadest category of helping behavior, and it's helping another person with intention, but it doesn't matter exactly what the motivation is. And then a subset of that, typically fewer behaviors according to some, is helping for the sake of internal rewards, feeling happy or satisfied about having helped. And then there's pure altruism, which is when another person is benefited and there's no external or internal reward expected or motivating that behavior. The only reason that you're helping the other person is for the sake of helping the other person without any other kind of benefits or rewards. Now, in contrast to that idea of pure altruism, we have a variety of motivations that are highlighted on the following slides for the rest of the slideshow today. And they're basically saying that when we help to help the other person, but we're also really interested in helping ourselves. And one concept that evolutionary psychologists bring to this debate about helping behavior and whether it's altruistic or simply motivated by self-interest is the idea of inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is kind of an interesting concept from evolution and genetics, and it basically argues that the ability of one's genes to survive in one's own offspring and in any related people is a notion of your genetic survival at the level of the genes. This means that your evolutionary line is certainly supported when you have children and they go on to reproduce. That's true, of course. But it's also supported by other people who are related to you. So, for example, if you have a brother or sister and they have children, their children share some of your genes too. So these nieces and nephews of yours are including your genes, and their survival is something that benefits you in a genetic sense. Not as directly as the survival of your own children, but it also is part of your genetic or evolutionary fitness. So what we find here is we often help people who are related to us, and the motivation for that is at an unconscious or biological level promoting the survival of our own genes in other people that are related to us. Kind of a funny quote from a biologist to emphasize this point is, he said, J.B.S. Haldane quoted as saying, "I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins." So 2 brothers, of course, would have the equivalent genetic contribution as his own life, and 8 cousins, since they're more distantly related, would be required to make a reasonable sacrifice for laying his own life down. So how does that relate in terms of research on helping behavior? This study looks at the tendency or the frequency of helping behavior depending upon the type of person that you're helping. And in particular, we're interested in whether or not that person is related to you. And at a more interesting level, whether that related person has reproductive potential. So the question that the researchers put to the participants in this study are similar to the ones you see here on the slide. If you were going to help someone, for example, lending them a car, would you be more or less likely to lend that to your brother, to a grandfather, a cousin, or an attractive stranger? Notice here that there are different levels of relatedness, and we're asking a fairly substantial favor. You're loaning your car to someone, and that's one type of helping, and it's the questions are focusing on people of different relatedness to you as the research participant. Now what we see on the next slide are the results that show that the percentage of people willing to volunteer with this helping behavior and a variety of other helping behaviors goes from high to almost none depending upon the degree of relatedness. So high degree of relatedness, parents, siblings, and children of the participants. Here we see about 75, almost 80% of people are willing to help. Moderate relatedness, these are grandparents, and keep in mind that grandparents aren't much help in terms of reproducing. That's a little bit lower. And then first cousins are a little bit more distant in terms of genetic relatedness. And then no genetic relatedness are the people who were least likely to be helped by the research participants. So it's showing that underlying the motivation to help must be, at some level, a recognition of helping people who are related is equivalent to helping oneself in terms of genetic fitness. That's the interpretation of the evolutionary psychologists. In addition, evolutionary psychologists recognize reciprocal aid. And reciprocal aid, when we talked about reciprocity norm earlier in the course, reciprocal aid is similar to that in the sense that we expect that if we help others, they'll return help. So if we are expecting that our help behavior will be reciprocated, then essentially we're kind of banking helping behavior when we help other people. And we're even more likely to do that kind of banking if we're related or familiar with the person that we're helping. We can kind of expect that we'll see them again. We can expect and trust that they'll help us when we need help. Other animals will help non-relatives if they live in close proximity to one another, and they can better survive by sharing that kind of assistance. So, for example, animals might warn each other of threats, they might share food, they might share grooming behaviors. These kinds of things help the animals survive. Similarly, people working for organizations that provide more benefits tend to work harder for that firm, and there's a sense of reciprocity that if the organization is supportive and helpful of their employees, then their employees are going to return the favor by working harder for them. We also see some interspecies help. So, for example, sometimes animals of different species will help warn each other about the presence of threat. Or you'll see people helping dogs, or dogs helping people, or dolphins helping people. So it's interesting there that even though we're arguing that genetic relatedness is important, we also see some pretty interesting examples of helping behaviors across species. So we'll look at some research that focuses on individual differences, learning to help, situational variation, focusing on the degree of similarity or familiarity with the people to be helped, and that kind of ties back to some genetic issues. And then finally this interaction, kind of a combination of recognizing genetic similarity and different types of need or different types of helping behavior. So let's look at that research. So first of all, we're recognizing that through the process of growing up, some people are encouraged to be more helpful to others than other individuals. And thus we have people who are more inclined to help and people who are less inclined to help. Much of that learning occurs early in adulthood, early in our lives, but some of it also occurs in early adulthood. So, for example, college students who are studying economics, which emphasizes the principle of self-interest and rationality, and the sort of irrationality of helping other people, particularly strangers, are, for example, less likely to contribute to charities, they're more likely to exploit a partner in an experimental bargaining game, and they're also more likely to negotiate for a lopsided and self-favoring payment in a negotiation game in a laboratory simulation. And most of those comparisons, although not all of them, are compared to students who are studying psychology or sociology, which tends to emphasize some appreciation of the cooperative and helpful behavior of human beings. Another individual difference variable we need to attend to is those individuals who have, through their socialization experiences, a broader sense of the in-group, or we. Children who are exposed to many different backgrounds, ethnic and religious backgrounds, as they're growing up, often have a broader sense of inclusive or we-ness with a larger human family. So, for example, European Gentiles who helped the Jews escape from the Nazis tended to have family histories where they were exposed to different ethnicities growing up than were the people who did not help the Jews in those situations. We also see research that indicates that we tend to be most helpful to those people who are similar to us or who seem familiar. So the evolutionary psychologists have asked why that might be. And they argue that familiarity may be one cue to genetic relatedness. And the reason being is that in our ancestral history, in the history that we evolved in, our ancestors tended to be encountered on a relatively frequent or almost daily basis. There was not nearly as much mobility as there is now in the modern world, and in that ancient world, people tended to live together in small, relatively small groups where people had a high chance of being genetically related to one another. So helping people who were similar to us in the past or familiar to us in the past tended to also mean helping people that were genetically related to us. So that tendency is embedded in our genetic code. The tendency to help relatives is stronger, so if we're kind of focusing on a combination of genetic relatedness and the different types of need, this research shows that the tendency to help relatives is stronger when the help is more related to survival. And the research participants in this study were asked to imagine some pretty intense scenarios, like the following. Let's imagine that there are 3 people asleep in different rooms of a burning house. We have a cousin, a grandfather, and an acquaintance, and you have time to rescue only one. Which one do you save? Now think about this from an evolutionary perspective. Who is going to be most helpful to you in terms of passing on your genetic material? An acquaintance is unlikely to be related to you at all. A grandfather is certainly related to you, but perhaps on the older side in terms of reproduction. And then you have a cousin who is related to you and possibly the same generation and prepared to pass on some portion of your genes. Here's another variation on that same study. There are 3 people that you need to run a small errand to go to the store. You have a cousin and a sister and acquaintance. Again, we see different degrees of genetic relatedness here. It's only a small favor. It's not a life and death matter. And you only have time to help one of these people. Which person do you run the errand for? What we see on this slide is an indication of something that we saw on the other study, which is basically that for everyday kinds of help, people tended to help the close relatives more than the non-relatives. So this is the everyday kind of help, running an errand to the store, that kind of thing. The closer related to a person, the more likely to pass on genetic material related to you, the higher the percentage or higher degree or tendency to help. Not exactly the same as the previous study that we talked about, but a similar pattern of results. But there's an interaction here. When we talk about matters of life and death, we see that the tendency is even more pronounced. So for people who you're going to rescue from a burning building or a similar life and death situation, the tendency to help people who are related to you is even more pronounced. The gray bars is the tendency that we saw on the previous slide, and the colored bars, which show an even steeper decline, is the life and death kind of helping. So shifting gears here, we have another motivation for helping, and that is gaining social status and approval. Now, what does status buy you? I just want to remind you that we've talked about status several times during the course. The lessons that we learned from the attraction lectures are that high status basically makes you more attractive. That's particularly true for men being seen as attractive by women. We also learned in the persuasion lectures that the more high status a person is, the more persuasive they are. We also learned in social exchange that high status people typically incur obligations to support and be supported by their subordinates. And finally, we see that high status tends to be associated with access to additional resources, which again can make a person more attractive to others. So some traditional pro-social ceremonies that are associated with high status are the following. We have in the book the description of the potluck ritual, in which a host from the Northwest American Indian, indigenous people tends to have these large, elaborate feasts, and at these feasts the host gives guests enormous quantities of precious goods, and the host gains status and also gains some expectation in the future that other people may help in times of need with either political or social support or possibly material support. Here in Alaska, we have the Inuit whaling captains, and one of the key things in that culture is that when the Inuit whaling captains and their small team of whalers come back from a successful hunt, rather than keeping all that whale meat to themselves and their immediate families, they share it with the whole community. That brings the Inuit whaling captain and his whaling crew a lot of status, but it also brings great benefit to the community. A similar but less well-known feast is the Inuit Messenger Feast, and this is when Inuits from the coastal north of Alaska meet with and trade with people from interior of Alaska, and through this process they exchange goods so from the coast, like marine mammals and fish, from interior Alaska, caribou, moose, and furs. These kinds of things are exchanged at this feast, and exchanged fairly freely in the spirit of reciprocity and mutual support, and those are the values that are important to that feast. All of these are different manifestations of helping norms. Helping norms are seen in many different cultures, and take one form or another in most cultures around the world, and that's pretty plain and easy to understand, since people are a social species and they are interdependent. So we have the reciprocity norm that we've talked about before. This is that we are obligated to help those who have helped us, basically trading a favor for a favor. We also have generalized reciprocity, which is basically the expectation that if we live in a community that has the reciprocity norm, that if we help someone, it's not so much that that specific person that we've helped will help us, but other people will help us in our time of need. And this is an idea of generalized reciprocity. Finally, we have the social responsibility norm, and this is the societal rule that people should help those who are in need of their assistance. In other words, we help people who are vulnerable, who need assistance, even if they cannot return the favor at some later point in time. So when you loan $5 to a homeless person, for example, you're not thinking that they're going to pay you back at some point in the future. This slide begins the discussion of perhaps one of the more famous studies in social psychology, and you've probably been exposed to it in introductory psychology or possibly a sociology class. The bystander is the definition of a person who is in or near a situation that requires help. Oftentimes it's emergency help, and there are other people who are also in that situation, and all of them are aware of and noticing the help or the emergency need, and some of them may participate in providing support, but many will not. So the bystander effect is a tendency of a bystander to be less likely to help an emergency if other onlookers are present. There are a variety of explanations for why this occurs. The first one is the diffusion of responsibility, and that's a tendency for each group member or each bystander to dilute personal responsibility for acting or helping by spreading it out among the other group members. It's a little bit tricky to understand when you hear it that way, but think of this situation. When there's a car pulled over to the side of the road and you're driving along and there's lots of traffic, you may just drive right past thinking, oh, someone. Think about calling on your cell phone to get help for them and think, oh, well, there's probably lots of other people who've already called. This is the diffusion of responsibility in a situation that you're probably familiar with. You just assume that someone else is going to pull over or that someone's already called for a tow truck. Imagine the same situation if you were driving along an empty road and there was someone pulled over by the side of the road. Their car was smoking or steaming or something like that. It's out in the middle of nowhere. There's virtually no traffic at all. In that situation, you are aware that you are the only person that is coming along to help, and there's no diffusion of responsibility. It's very clear that it's your responsibility and no one else's to help. So there's no bystander effect when you're the only person. There are not multiple bystanders. A second reason for the bystander effect is the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance. And this occurs when bystanders to an emergency, trying to look poised, give misleading cues to others that no help is needed. So this situation is a little bit trickier. Basically, if everyone is acting like it's normal, then it's hard to understand that there's actually a problem, and it's hard to act on a problem or provide assistance if no one is actually interpreting the problem as a situation that help is needed. So imagine again, you're walking downtown, there's a person lying on the street, lying on the sidewalk. Maybe they're lying on a sidewalk up against a trash can, or they're lying up against the side of a building, and everyone's just walking past. Now, if everyone's walking past, then that probably means that the person's just drunk or sleepy and just sitting there, and not that they have actually fallen down and knocked themselves out or fallen down with a heart attack. Because as you're walking past, no one else seems to be caring or no one else seems to be noticing, so it seems to you that there isn't an emergency, there's no need for help. So it could be, however, that the person has actually had a heart attack and everybody's walking past like nothing's going on, because maybe people think that person's drunk. So that would be an example of pluralistic ignorance. So let's look at some research that looks at whether or not diffusion of responsibility or pluralistic ignorance is going on. And it really can be one or the other, or sometimes even both. So in this study, participants came into a research laboratory and were filling out questionnaires. And as they were doing that, the researchers pumped smoke into the laboratory through a vent while the students were filling out the questionnaire. Some of the students were left alone in this room where the smoke came in. some were with 2 other real participants, or some were with 2 Confederates who pretended like nothing was wrong. So let's look at the first 2 conditions there. The students who were randomly assigned to fill out a questionnaire all by themselves in a laboratory where smoke started coming in through the vent. What do you think they did? Do you think they told the experimenter that there was smoke coming in and there might be some problem? Well, the answer is yes. They did that at a fairly high level of they noticed and they jumped up and told the researcher that what was going on. When there was 2 other participants present, basically 3 people in a room where the smoke starts to come in, they kind of looked at each other and were kind of wondering, what should we do? Maybe they were assuming that someone else is going to say something. There we have the diffusion of responsibility. And then finally, we have a situation where there's 2 other people in the participant's situation, but those 2 other people are actually not real participants, they're Confederates, and they have been instructed to pretend like there's nothing wrong. So they're really kind of creating that environment of pluralistic ignorance. So let's look at the degree of reporting the smoke to the researcher, which is kind of a helping behavior. Hey, there's a problem here in the laboratory, as a function of those 3 conditions. So when they were sitting by themselves, nearly 80% of people got up and reported to the researcher that there was something wrong because there was smoke coming out of the vent. When there was 2 real participants, there appears to be some diffusion of responsibility because we go from like 78% all the way down to about 40%, where people seem to be waiting for someone else to do something, waiting for someone else to report that there's a problem. And finally, the lowest level of helping, or lowest frequency or percentage of people helping, was when 2 calm Confederates were present, acting as if nothing was going on. And so the was probably thinking, oh, there's no emergency here because nobody's acting like there's a problem. Now let's think about this for a moment. Is there any kind of informational influence going on? It could be that when 2 people are acting like things are normal, the 3rd person, who's the real participant, assumes that they know what they're talking about, or they know what they're reacting about, and so it must be okay. So there might be some kind of informational influence going on, even though pluralistic ignorance tells you that that information is incorrect. So as I was saying, the results suggest that people look to other people for information. If no one seems upset, it suggests that there isn't an emergency. So that is an interpretation that relates to pluralistic ignorance. We also see from other research that sometimes bystanders are a source of approval or disapproval. Sometimes people will assume that help will be seen as an unwelcome intrusion. So for example, there's a study that's reported in your book. There's a man and a woman fighting in a mall in a staged kind of performance that researchers were staging for the sake of research. And when the woman and man are fighting in the mall and the woman shouts, "I don't even know you," then many more people were likely to help than if she shouted, "I don't know why I married you." So in the latter case, you might see that people are reluctant to get involved because they may see that as unwelcome. In addition, we also have people worried about how their helping will be evaluated or whether they'll be effective help. So for example, maybe you're not the best car mechanically inclined kind of person, and you see a car pulled over beside the road, and the hood is up and there's steam coming out, and you're the only person to help, but you're worried that if you try to help and you pull over and stick your head under the car hood there and look at it and say, gee, I don't know what to do, that'll be kind of like worse than providing no help at all. Or maybe there's a medical situation, someone needs medical attention, and you're worried that if you try to help, you might actually make matters worse, or you'll be ineffective in your helping. So sometimes we are resistant to, or inhibited in helping because we're worried about other situations such as unwelcome help or ineffective help. The following slide here shows sort of a series of decision making that a person might go through as they're trying to determine whether or not to help. So let's begin on the far left side with emergency helping. Let me adjust this slide just a little bit so it's all on there. Oops, there we go. So we begin over here. The first step to whether or not help will be offered is noticing the event. And sometimes people don't notice the help needing event, the emergency, because they're distracted by other features of the situation. Maybe there's too many people around, they fail to notice, or maybe they're hurrying along and they fail to notice because they're very focused on getting to some other place. But if they do notice the event, the next step is to interpret whether the event is an emergency or not. Here's where pluralistic ignorance can come in. Everybody's walking by that person lying on the sidewalk. People don't think it's an issue because maybe it's just a sleepy homeless person, or maybe it's a drunk homeless person. People aren't thinking, oh, that person needs medical attention because they've fallen and hit their head. Otherwise, lots of people would already be down there trying to help. So sometimes we may not interpret an event as an emergency because other people are behaving as if it isn't an emergency. But let's say that we do interpret it as an emergency. The next step is to assume responsibility. Is it my responsibility? Is it my individual and unique responsibility to help this person? If there are a bunch of bystanders present, we might have the problem of diffusion of responsibility. We have failed to assume personal responsibility. We assume that other people will take charge and be responsible for helping. But let's assume that we don't diffuse responsibility and we instead assume responsibility. The next step is to know the appropriate form of assistance. Here we have evaluation apprehension, concern that if we don't know how to help properly, we have a lack of knowledge or a lack of competence, then other people might judge us for not providing effective support, and so there we might not help. However, let's assume instead that we do know the appropriate form of assistance. We go on to implement our decision, and then we have a last-minute kind of calculation. We think about the risk to ourselves. We think about legal concerns, such as will we be sued if we help and then fail to help effectively. We worry about embarrassment. We worry about any number of costs of helping, and if those costs are too high, then we may not help. However, let's assume that after all of these things, a person decides that the benefits of helping outweigh the risks, and they do decide to intervene and offer assistance. So what this slide does is remind us that there are any number of social psychological factors that could intervene to prevent you from receiving help in an emergency. It's like a series of decisions and considerations and perceptions that may interfere with providing help. And research has backed up all of those kind of decision points. So now let's look at some other selfish motivations for helping. Desire for approval, the effects of helping on those around us, and finally this interaction between gender and help. So as an individual difference variable, we can measure people with a questionnaire that will indicate whether they are high in need for approval from others or lower in need for approval from others. And what they find is that students who are very high in need from approval from others will tend to donate more money to charitable causes. However, they will only do that if the donation is public, and thus they can talk about it, they can show it off to others, and buy approval in a sense. If the donation opportunity is only for anonymous donations, those with high desire for approval are no more likely to donate than people with low desire for approval. We also see as a situational influence on behavior that observing helping models, these are other individuals who are helping, not like supermodels that provide volunteering, So just in the social psychological or social learning kind of perspective, models of modeling behavior. If we observe another person giving help or volunteering, that can teach young children about the helping norm, and when they copy that helping behavior, there's increase in helping behavior as a function of having seen the helping model. For adults, a model can remind them of the helping norm. So one of the things that we see is that when other people talk about having provided some kind of voluntary service or voluntary donation, we are reminded of the helping norm and may increase our helping behavior. So the theoretical perspective that best describes these findings, that's the social learning theory. That's right. As another situational influence, we find an interesting relationship or association between helping behavior and population density. The interesting thing is helping is actually less likely in densely packed cities. Why is this? Well, one explanation might be what we were talking about a moment ago, the diffusion of responsibility. The more densely packed or dense population dense an area is, the more likely we might have that bystander intervention situation. Part of the problem is that people living in dense urban environments pay less attention to those around them. There's lots of distractions. That's part of the explanation as well. When we look at the combination of individual differences and situations, we find that there is a gender difference in helping, and that gender difference in helping depends upon the type of help that we're talking about. Women are generally, in the stereotype sense, perceived as kinder, more soft-hearted, and more helpful, and they tend to be overrepresented in the ranks of volunteers. So particularly when we look at non-emergency, voluntary types of help, women are much more likely to be involved in those efforts than are men. However, over 90% of Carnegie Hero Awards go to men, and these are helping behaviors in emergency, high-risk kinds of situations. So the explanation is that men are more likely to take these kinds of risks, and their socialization, that is, growing up, they're encouraged to engage in those kinds of behaviors. So men and women engage in lots of helping behavior, but they tend to engage in different types of helping behavior. Not all of them, of course, but as a general trend. Another gender effect is that women are more likely to help those they already know. Some explanations for why that might be is physical differences in the type of help provided. Oh, I'm sorry, this goes back to the previous slide. The physical differences, men have a little bit more of the physical capabilities that are involved in that kind of heroic Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Medal type of behavior. And as I said on the previous slide with the Carnegie Awards for heroism, men are more likely to help strangers in those emergency kinds of situations. All right, one last slide here before we wrap up. Oh yeah, okay. Well, if we were in our face-to-face class, we might get you together to brainstorm and discuss different types of helping behavior and different examples of helping behavior from the news media. And that concludes this slide show.